Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining here today. And let me welcome you, everyone who is here in the room and the people who are joining online through the YouTube stream. As I heard, maybe there are even more people watching the conference online than being here in this room. And let me introduce and open the second day of the Budapest-based conference of the Resonances Research Project. Our first panel today will be Agent Vectors and Mediators, and I am Kristóf Nagy, the research fellow of the Kemp-Welch, and I will moderate and chair this morning panel of today. And first of all, practical information. We will have 4 presentations today, and we will have a chance to have a joint discussion after the 4th panel. So please keep your questions and comments through the presentations. Take a piece of paper and write down your questions freely, because we will have a 20-25 minutes at the end of the 4th panel when all the speakers will come here, and we could have a small roundtable and questions and so on. And now let me introduce the first presenters of the day. They are Hana Buddeus and Pavlína Morganová from Prague, and their presentation is entitled A Direct Communicator of Information in and Out, Petr Štembera in the 1970s. And let me also briefly introduce our speakers. Hana is a researcher in the Institute of Art History in the Czech Academy of Sciences, and she is also a member of the Institute of Photography Research Center. Now I'm standing in a better position. Her research interests include the 20th century art history, and especially photography histories, with a special focus of its intersections, such as circulations of art through the medium of photography. 5 years ago, her dissertation was published under the title Representation Without Representation, Photography and Performances in the 1970s Czech Art. From 2019 to 2020, she took part of the 5-year project, Sudek project, dealing with the photographic collections of the Prague-based photographer Josef Sudek. She also edited a couple of related publications to this project, such as the Instant Presence Representing Art in Photography, Sudek and Sculpture. And since 2021, she also a member of the curatorial team of the Photograph Gallery in Prague. And the other presenter of this first lecture is Pavlína Morganová, who is an art historian and curator, and who is currently the director of Research Center of the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague. She conducted several researches on the medium of exhibition, and she is also the co-author of the publication, The Exhibition as Medium, Czech Art from 1957 to 1999. She is the author of a couple of books, such as A Walk Through Prague, Actions, Performances, Happenings, 1949, 1989, and the Czech Action Art, Happenings, Actions, Events, Land Art, Body Art, and Performance Art, Behind the Iron Curtain. She also lectures Czech art of the 20th century.
It's fine.
It's getting too long, but I could continue for additional 10 minutes, believe me. So now it's a time to give them the mic and welcome you and
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks Zsuzsa and Emese for putting the program together, I really enjoyed, and I hope that we will also enjoy today's program. And let me start. In May 2016, Maya and Ruben Folks organized a conference titled Contested Spheres, Artworks Under Socialism here in Budapest, and I was happy to participate with a paper on Petr Štembera. 6 years later, I'm here again with a paper on Štembera, in this case prepared together with Pavlína Morganová, and I hope to use this opportunity to rethink what Štembera's contribution to the field means. When going through the respective literature, I was surprised to learn that the name of Štembera is the most frequent of all the artists' names contained in the index of already mentioned Klara Kemp-Welch's book, Networking the Bloc. Moreover, his name has the second highest number of occurrences at all, just after photographic documentation. The aim of this presentation is to try to formulate what lies behind this simple acknowledgement and to present Štembera as an important mediator within the 1970s artists' network. He communicated in both directions, as he not only spread information about the Czechoslovak contemporary art scene abroad, as Klara, Kemp-Welch and Maya Folks have already pointed out, but also collected information from abroad and spread it inside, which is the part Pavlína is going to speak about. My task is to try to briefly summarize what we already know and hopefully to offer possible new methodological approaches to be discussed. Or not new, but some methodological approaches to be discussed. Our intention is to propose that we shift our focus from the idea of networking to the process of mediation itself, and to talk about circulation not only as a means of communication, but as a space that enables a specific kind of presentation and materialization.
Petr Štembera was definitely one of the most active communicators on the Czech art scene in the 1970s. And his rich contacts are a reflection not just of his artistic ambitions, but also of his broad intellectual interest. His story actually starts in 1960s when he began working at the library of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Prague. I didn't know what kind of slide to put there, so I actually went to the library, which is one of the best art history libraries in Prague, and I pull out some of the books Petr Štembera actually wrote. He's a specialist on Alfons Mucha and Art Nouveau posters, so this is just, like an illustration. It is important to remember that he had an exclusive intellectual background at home, since his stepfather, Jiří Štembera, was a philosopher and assistant of Jan Patočka, and his mother was a language teacher. He obviously knew German and English when he started to work at the library, and later in different departments of the museum. Those days, the working routine wasn't so intensive, so he had time to go through foreign magazines and soon started to correspond with various galleries. At the same time, he studied museology and librarianship, the era's information science, at the Faculty of Social Science. Štembera closely followed developments on the Czech art scene in the second half of the 1960s. As Hana mentioned, he was intensively sending information out, but he was bringing a lot in as well. The second part of his activity became crucial, especially after 1968, with the start of so-called normalization in Czechoslovakia, when all art magazines ceased to exist, and the official gallery infrastructure was again reserved only for a narrow circle of prominent communist artists. In this situation, it was extremely important to keep the flow of information going. Štembera, with his position at the library of the Museum of Decorative Arts, and for those days rare knowledge of languages, was in the perfect situation. As he said in one of the interviews, against the false, mediated communication of the official media, we put, of course not programmatically, straight communication, immediate, reversible information flow.
Let me now sum up some of the already known facts. Štembera is definitely one artist who took full advantage of private networks and who remained faithful to the idea of dematerialized art disseminated through an alternative informational network as defined by Lucy Lippard in 1969. His name appears in Klaus Groh's If I Had a Mind, concept art, project art, in which, as Maya Folks pointed out, he presented art that was a kind of information transmitter and a way of behavior, which was definitely something that interested Štembera. He was in contact with Klaus Groh from the early 1970s, and his role in putting together Aktuelle Kunst in Osteuropa was mentioned several times, as were his contacts with Jorge Glusberg. Štembera's texts, events, happenings, land art, etc. in Czechoslovakia was published in December 1970 in Revista de Arte and later also in Lippard's 6 years. Štembera mailed artists and creators his works, his events realized in the nature, his typewritten meteorological information, and ascetical pieces, and simple physical activities, already mentioned by Magdalena yesterday, such as typewriting, button fastening, and sewing, and lace tying, which he documented through photographs, and which he called handpieces, daily activities. With Narcissus, a piece he realized on several occasions in 1974, he finally switched to performance, but the correspondence continued. Štembera's most important contacts have already been well described by Kemp-Welch and others. Besides the already mentioned Klaus Groh in Germany and Jorge Glusberg in Argentina, other authors include Jean-Marc Poinsot and Geneviève Benamou in France, Tom Marioni, Terry Fox, Allan Kaprow, or Chris Burden in the United States, Jarosłav Kozłowski, Henryk Gajewski, or Kwiek Kulik in Poland, László Beke in Hungary, and many others. It is also a well-known fact that thanks to contacts with Helena Kontova and Giancarlo Politi, his and other works by Eastern European artists were published in Flash Art magazine. Existing contacts led to new ones, as documented by the letter sent to Henryk Gajewski that I am showing you now, in which Štembera, among other things, thanks him for passing on his contact to Grzegorz Jamski in Poznań. Also, he says that he thinks that in this comparison, the artists from East were in worse than the West ones. Yet another foreign contact which I find very relevant in relation to Štembera is the Belgian curator Roger Dont and his new Reform Gallery. Štembera and Dont were in contact from the early 1970s, and there exist dozens of letters and postcards from that time, as well as vintage photographic documentation. Dont sent catalogs to Štembera and published Štembera's artist book, which he distributed to all relevant people. In my paper for the first Resonances conference, I proposed taking a material approach to the photographic documentation of performance art. Today, within the context of this conference series and with a view to the theory of cultural transfer, I would like to point to the existence of a closely related methodological line of thought within the photography studies, which is my field of expertise. In the latest issue of History of Photography, devoted to the topic of circulating photographs, in the introduction, the issue editors show that a circulation, quote, circulation and mobility are modalities as old as photography, but that we are still missing a history that discusses these acts of transmission as the critical framework for creating photographic meaning, end of quote. To follow this line of thought, I shall now borrow the term proposed by the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai. In a 2015 lecture held at the University of Cologne, Appadurai relates materiality and mediality in a way that seems productive to an understanding of our topic. He moves our focus away from the actants, referring to Bruno Latour, and onto a smaller class of agentive entities, which he proposes calling mediantes. The materiality and mediation of these little things that mediate, to use his definition, are always dynamically producing one another. This means that, quote, when we study mediation, we want to always ask what materiality on the other side is being produced. Conversely, when we study material flows, always pay attention on the mediating logics because they are adding value, producing value, obscuring value, etc. End of quote. This seems to be very helpful when we want to approach the materiality and circulation of the so-called dematerialized art of the 1970s. In Petr Štembera's case, those little things that mediate were materialized in the form of envelopes filled with photographs and typewritten letters written in German and English, which traveled abroad to the postboxes of relevant addressees, regardless of whether or not the artist himself was allowed to travel.
If I may continue, the results of Štembera's mediation was the creation of hundreds of texts, which he brought to attention to his circle of acquaintances, and very often translated for them. His activities had an impact not just on his closest friends involved in performance art, but reached different fields as well. When I contacted Štembera and asked him about his translating activities, he remembered that he had translated a number of texts on the art of performance, but he also mentioned Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn and Marshall McLuhan. If we remember one McLuhan's main message, namely that medium is the message, because it is the medium which shapes and determines forms of human association and activity, it is obvious that Štembera was very much aware of it. Štembera's situation was actually very different from that of, for instance, Jiří Valoch or László Beke. He had nothing. No archive, no correspondence, no copies of the samizdat literature he was producing. Although the situation with samizdat publication is very unclear, we usually don't know where a text comes from, who selected it, who translated it, and who typed it. Despite the lack of obvious proof, we know that Štembera was very active in this field. The only McLuhan samizdat in the collection of Libri Prohibiti archive of samizdat literature in Prague is a 7 pages written translation of the chapter on commercials from The Medium is the Message. It is not clear if it is Štembera's translation because nobody can find the original translation of McLuhan, but several people remember it. During my research, I found, this is actually that copy from Libri Prohibiti. During my research, I found only 2 clear mentions translated by Petr Štembera. This is one of them, přeložil Petr Štembera. Vladimír Ambros, it's another Czech performer and conceptual artist, made 2 samizdat booklets out of Štembera's translations and other texts, which are still in his possession. It is quite interesting to see the themes which are covered in these booklets. Beside contemporary theories and philosophy, there are also translations of literature and theater, including translations of plays by Eugen Ionesco and Samuel Beckett, and an interpretation of George Orwell's Animal Farm by Frank Thompson. Ambros and Štembera obviously shared an interest in the role of reproduction and medium of photographer. There are several texts on that there. Another interesting finding is that Štembera's circles of acquaintances was interested not only in progressive artistic trends, but also in music. Ambros selected texts, as he called them, these 2 samizdat booklets, included texts on Erik Satie, and while searching through the collection at Libri Prohibiti, I came across a samizdat booklet from 1988 about the history of the Residents, the music group, famous music group, written by Jaroslav Petran and Radek Fitz, with notes by Petr Štembera. When I asked Štembera about this, he said that Klaus Groh had been supplying him with new music, such Philip Glass and Steve Reich, which he then tried to present to the members of the Czech section, a semi-official organization later criminalized by the communist regime. Another interesting area of activity involves texts about Zen Buddhism and phenomenology. For example, the collection of samizdat literature saved by Jiří Kovenda contains a number of these translations, some of which were done by Kovenda himself or by other friends. It is difficult to distinguish today. Štembera's circle didn't work as systematically as Petr Rezek, who created, I actually presented his collection of samizdat on the first Resonance conference. And Petr Rezek really created a distinctive series of samizdat publications, always devoted to a certain artist, tendency, or artist. And it was really like an addition. As far as I know, Štembera put together only 2 thematic samizdat volumes, one called Performance, etc., and other was Body Art and Performance. The rest of Štembera's activities were more like those of a magazine editor who compiles texts on a wide variety of interesting topics. Sometimes it might be an individual text or an interview that he found in a foreign magazine. Sometimes there were more texts on a certain issue, and other times it was a mixture of various topics, all compiled into one volume. This approach probably reflected his broad personal interests. As with any other samizdat activities, it was based on personal enthusiasm, zeal, and sense of excitement, without any notion of profit other than intellectual one. As Tomáš Glanz pointed out in his study Samizdat as the Medium, some theorists in Russia have argued that unofficial activities were indirectly sponsored by the state because people's jobs were such that they could do other things at work but still get paid. This was probably the case with Petr Štembera, who was able to study, read, and communicate with his friends in Prague and correspond with his friends abroad during working hours. Plus, he had the exclusive possibility to study foreign magazines in the museum's library that weren't publicly accessible during normalization, but were only for internal use. This is quite important. Glanz also points out that an alternative exchange of samizdat literature created so-called impossible communities or nameless communities, because samizdat mediation created a certain quality of partnerships based on the unique constellation of privacy, affinity, and shared values, as well as on postal correspondence or physical contact.
In conclusion, thanks to Štembera's intense and broad mediation, documentation of artistic activities made it to otherwise distant galleries outside Czechoslovakia, and also made information from abroad available in the Czech language. In some cases, we can trace both sides of the information transmission. One example of this would be the case of Terry Fox. Thanks to Pavlína's research, we know that Štembera translated some of Fox's texts and an interview with him that was published in Domus magazine in 1973, and that at the same time he informed Fox about his own activities. And now the last 2 sentences. As we know, the material approach is historically closely related to the process of decolonization, as it is intended to recover the neglected materials. It seems to me that the two-way exchange of information and materials that we have described here turns our attention to the existence of a vibrant shared space in which communication truly took place and which can therefore be of help as we try to leave behind a description of networking as nothing more than a way of reaching the dreamed for West. Thank you.
Thank you.